Welcome, everyone, to the Captive Audience. I'm Kevin Hoare, and it is 26th of November. I'm recording this a bit earlier in the day due to some schedule conflicts later, but I hope you enjoy this. I'm just doing a rundown of a lot of the news that I see. Some I saw yesterday, but really didn't have time to cover with the really good show that we had with Ed Deal. So take a look at that one from yesterday, but other headlines that I think might be really interesting for you to hear and learn more about. Uh, let's start out today by talking a bit about, I guess you could say it was described as, by the Oregon Catalyst, as the funniest homeless story of 2024. It is a real um, moment of truth. It's what they would call a Washington gaffe, where they accidentally tell the truth. It was captured by independent journalist and prior guest on our show, Kevin Dahlgren, on the streets of Portland. A liberal activist had her cell phone stolen by some homeless folks, and she tells the homeless folks that it's okay to steal a phone from a rich person, but it's not okay to steal it from her because she is, quote, a good person. Here's what she said: "If you stole it from rich scum, by all means keep it, but I'm like an honest person." So um, Kevin Dahlgren filmed her trying to retrieve her iPhone back from the homeless people who possibly stole it. And she encouraged them to sell anything they steal from the rich scum, but that she's a nice and honest person. And she says she won't call police on them. And of course, we're all rooting for her to get her cell phone back. But it's quite interesting how this manifests itself over and over, that they're convinced that crime is something that's okay if it happens to people who are not them. But when it happens to them, it's really terrible and very unfair. KGW did a news segment on the Portland's homeless problem, and actually their news vehicle broken into. The reporter turned around and said, as we were talking with those living on this strip, a homeless couple broke into our news car. They smashed the window and stole all of our electronics and personal belongings. And then Coin 6 TV in Portland had a similar story. They were in a Milwaukee church parking lot, and the homeless stole an entire trailer full of donated clothes for the homeless. And then a drug addict with a Mother Teresa jacket broke into Portland's St. Michael's Church and stole from them 3 different times. Um, it's something where people can't come to terms with the fact that maybe there's a problem with the double standard about crime, that some criminals are the victims and others are bad because they victimized the people who were supposedly feeling sorry for them and trying to help them and have the right politics, or happen to be the news trying to report on something as it's happening live. It's time for people to finally come to terms with the fact that this is bad news for everyone. And in a related story, we talked yesterday about how ranked choice voting took place in Portland, but was rejected statewide. And maybe ranked choice voting in Portland so confused people that they voted against, but in larger numbers against ranked choice voting. That was Measure 117. Well, it's a story in the Oregon Catalyst by the Taxpayers Association that lays out how they believe the underdog, Keith Wilson, won the Portland mayor's race, again, in a ranked choice voting system. In the past, there were we had the past city council, as well as and so there were 3 city commissioners who were running for mayor, and all 3 of the city commissioners from the existing city commission lost to this newcomer, Keith Wilson. And the Taxpayers Association says you may want to pay attention. The Taxpayers Association they acquired one of his brochure mailings from Keith Wilson. He said, while almost Every one of the 19 Portland mayor candidates talked about homelessness. Wilson stood out with his bold pitch: end unsheltered homelessness in Portland. It followed with a high profile campaign pledge to end homelessness in a single year. His master plan: to continually sell the homeless into moving into homes, new homes, until they give in. In parentheses, the article says no joke. This is actually his commitment. The candidate that everyone favored, thought was the favorite, Rene Gonzalez, ran on a tough love campaign by banning encampments. This was popular, but Wilson actually promised the same thing, the same result, but with no sacrifice, no police action, and no one being inconvenienced. It's kind of like the old promise that you can lose weight and eat anything you want. And as we know, that doesn't exist in the real world. As a CEO, Keith Wilson also had the money to reach a lot of people and get his message out there. He included the fact that he had a strong connection with the Obama administration, which appeals to people in Portland still. And so apparently that was enough to stand out from the other 19 candidates. So Portland's taken a massive bet on a virtually unknown and untested person who simply had an effective, I should say, set of slogans that sounds like no pain, all gain, no pain. Unfortunately, this sounds a lot like what we've been told repeatedly by Democrats in the state of Oregon for a long time. Going back to a story that we talked about last night, as of yesterday, there were about 600 ballots left to be counted in the House District 22 race due to signature issues. And this article actually lays out what everyone's doing in some detail. Is precisely 596 ballot packets remain unaccepted because of signature verification. There's volunteers running around knocking the doors in the district, calling ahead this past weekend, urging voters to come in and complete all of this. And the certification will be complete and done as of December 2nd. We mentioned yesterday that the consequence would be that, along with the seats the Democrats flipped in Bend, that used to be Senator Tim Knopp's seat, they would have a 3/5 supermajority. Now, that doesn't mean you can't deny quorum, but of course, as we know, this was done in the last session by a bunch of state senators, and the result was, of course, that they weren't able to run for re-election under changes made to state law. But we'll see, because if it's bad enough, then maybe they will. But so 3/5 is enough to pass taxes without asking for a vote of the people, but not enough to get the 2/3 they need for quorum. So anyway, we're waiting to see what happens with this, and if we have any updates on that, we'll be sure to let you know. As of right now, I believe it was 149 ballots short is what we saw yesterday. I haven't checked today. And there was a really good article that was alluded to by Ed Deal in our interview last night, how a handful of grassroots groups in the country built a ground game that turned out to be critical to Trump's victory. They went and they watched. It's a group called the American Majority Action. And they watched what was done in Florida in 2022, where in Florida, they aimed at trying to turn out low propensity voters instead of spending gobs of money and media on persuading undecided swing voters, many of whom tend to be college educated women. They instead focused on what turned out to be a lot of lower propensity, often working class males and minorities. They took this very successful program that was done in Florida in 2022, and they deployed it in 4 swing states: Arizona, Nevada, North Carolina, and Wisconsin. And this conservative grassroots nonprofit, American Majority Action, uh, executed on this. They went after conservatives who rarely or never vote in elections, encouraging them and even cajoling them, actually, not only to vote, but to vote early. And they went out of their way to make sure that they encouraged them to get absentee ballots so that they would run up the score on early voting with absentee ballots and get them all turned in as soon as possible. This we saw in some of the numbers we heard reported before we ever got to election day, that the lead that Democrats enjoyed in many of these states in early voting was far smaller than it had been in the past. And in some cases, Republicans led. Uh, and this really led to what turned out to be a comfortable margin um, in many of these states, which is why we saw the race called on election night instead of dragging on and being undecided. The there were states where the vote was very close for U.S. Senate races. We didn't pull one out in Wisconsin, but uh, that margin of victory for the Democrat in that state was very, very narrow compared to past Democrat margins. And and so they talked about the details of how they pulled this off, exporting the Florida model. A guy named Ned Ryan, who's the CEO of American Majority. I've met him. He's a smart guy, um, very focused and engaged. And he explained to the Federalists in late September that they were doing this because they saw how they turned Florida into a reliably red state when it used to be the ultimate swing state. 2018, Ron DeSantis only won by a fraction of 1%. And this time he won by 19%. So they have figured out how to replicate this. And maybe this is something that has to be looked at in far more states, because there's no reason why it couldn't narrow the gap. And in the example I just gave of House District 22 and this super minority situation that we're facing, clearly could have made a difference. So they set a goal to make sure that 80% of those ballots would come back. The ones that they did absentee or early voting. And it just made it a lot more difficult for Democrats to win out. They saw it reflected in the polling, and they found themselves, in the case of Wisconsin, 3 times better in terms of the situation versus 2020, where they cut into the early voting margin that Democrats enjoyed in 2020. The 600,000 plus advantage Biden enjoyed was cut to 200,000. That clearly made a difference in a state that was as close as Wisconsin. And then, of course, allow them to deploy their resources earlier. They did this in Nevada. They had 300 ballot chasers focused on Clark County, home to Las Vegas, the state's largest city. And they were able to get a lead of more than 43,000 votes in early in-person voting going into Election Day. North Carolina, 50,000 absentee ballots were generated directly by the project's efforts. And then in Arizona, they had 500 volunteers going around door knocking, phone banking, and text outreach. That meant that Trump entered the day with 130,000 vote early vote margin. And as you know, Republicans tend to do well traditionally on Election Day anyway, which is what happened. And that's how they were able to pull this out pretty decisively, even if it took them a while to count all of this. And so this article goes into some more detail, but I think this is something we should all have on our radar. And Ed Diehl talked about that last night. It might actually be cheaper to turn out a certain Republican voter who's low propensity than to spend a bunch of money trying to persuade a certain voter who's undecided to vote your way. Shifting back to Oregon and Portland, and specifically Secretary of State's office was asked to investigate a city council candidate in the recent election, a guy named Ben Huffert, who owns a restaurant or a bar of some kind. And there was a report that from Willamette Week that this place called Fortune that he co-owns, was telling people that either they donate $10 to his campaign or they have to pay a $20 cover fee in order to get into his bar. And it shows that in that time frame when this is being offered, he received 170 donations, is what Willamette Week said. And well, that would be illegal under Oregon revised statute. It prohibits candidates from using undue influence, which means offering something of value in return for a campaign contribution to solicit contributions. So there was a request to investigate this. Dan Meek, who's an independent party guy, said that it was involved with the complaint, but the Secretary of State's office says news articles on the topic do not constitute evidence and are not sufficient evidence, therefore, to show that an alleged violation occurred. And it's a complaint-driven system, so unless the complaint can actually offer more evidence, there's no way to proceed with it, is what they've said. So now Dan Meek said this is absurd. He said that this is he is aware and sort of advising, but not one of the complainants, and said it's baseless and stupid that they can't use an article that cites the facts that it does as evidence. But this is what you're going to get from the Secretary of State going forward, most likely. Back to the 2020 election and nationally, apparently the Christian vote, especially Catholics, turned out to be critical to Trump's win. Among self-identified Christians, Trump received 56% of their votes compared to Harris receiving 60% from non-Christians. And as we know, there's been an underperformance in Christian vote in the past, which has been very frustrating to many Republicans, where that would seem to be an obvious constituency. And so said, although Harris won a larger share of the non-Christian vote than Trump's share of Christian votes, Christians outnumber non-Christian voters by more than a 5-2 margin. And this contributed to President Trump's victory. So not only did most of Trump's vote come from Christian, but they gave him a 17 million vote cushion over Harris, which obviously proved to be an insurmountable lead. They represented 72% of the voters who actually turned out in the election nationwide. The report also found that Catholics had a record high turnout despite overall voter and Christian voter turnout being well below what it was in 2020. So even though the overall turnout for Christians was lower than 2020, Catholics were higher. And that was 70% of Catholics reported voting compared to 2020's 67%. And so this is not a irrelevant statistic, because these Midwestern states actually have, like Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Ohio, that the ones that are supposedly in the blue wall did swing towards Republicans in this election, and they have a lot of Catholics there. And so some of the messaging that Harris focused on actually alienated Catholics. I think we saw that the Michigan governor made that really strange statement about taking Eucharist from some bizarre person that wasn't not a priest, kind of mocking Catholics. Now looking back, that might have been more serious than originally assumed in terms of impacting people in the media markets that we're talking about. Little news on the international front. President Biden has announced a ceasefire between Israel and Hezbollah. Uh, we'll see what happens, except that it says that the ceasefire gives Israel 60 days to pull its forces out of Lebanon. We'll see if that happens. Supposedly, one of the reports this morning is that Biden, his people, threatened Israel with not vetoing a UN resolution condemning Israel for its actions in Lebanon and for invading, even though they've been constantly shelled and rocketed from Lebanon for many months before they ever took any action. Israel has done a lot of damage to Hezbollah and killed several of its high-profile leaders, but we'll see what this turns into. I think that there's going to be quite the celebration when Biden exits the presidency. A big celebration in Israel. So the Canadian and Mexican leaders have responded to a threat from President Trump to impose tariffs, really severe tariffs, 25% tariffs on Canada and Mexico. And this would be they'll remain in place until the border is secure and fentanyl stops flowing into the United States as an incentive to them to do their part. The Canadian Prime Minister said he had a very good phone call right after that with President Trump, and said they're going to find a lot of common ground and talk about the facts, laying out the facts about how they can work together. The Mexican president, who's a new person, Claudia Sheinbaum, has replaced the guy who was there before, who did seem to have a good working relationship with Trump. But is also a very liberal, almost Marxist guy. Well, she is too, maybe even further to the left. And her response was that, well, caravans of migrants are no longer reaching the border, which, of course, we know Mexico has total control over that. But she complained that U.S. weapons are being smuggled into Mexico and said that the movement of drugs is a problem of public health and consumption in the U.S., not Mexico's fault. So I guess we'll see if that makes any difference for President Trump. She also came out and said that if a percentage of what the United States spends on war were dedicated to peace and development, that would actually address the underlying causes of migration and it would stop. We've heard that canard before. Remember, the border czar, Kamala Harris, was put in charge of attacking the root causes of migration in the countries further to the south of Mexico that are actually responsible for a lot of the caravans that come up through Mexico. And that was a totally failed policy. But apparently the current Mexican president believes in it. She says they're going to negotiate as equals. There's no subordination because they're a great nation. But she says he thinks they're going to reach an agreement. The article does go on to talk about how they are. Mexico is going to find out that the United States is in the stronger position here and will definitely get its way. Although Sheinbaum said that she does not want to implement the Remain in Mexico policy. We'll see who wins out. She apparently has not paid close attention to what the election results have said in the United States. Here's good news. Utah and some western states are asking the Supreme Court to return millions of acres of land back to the states, saying that anything that does not have a congressional designation to it, but has been appropriated as land by the federal government has no legal basis for continuing to manage or control that land. They're called unappropriated lands. And so this lawsuit won't impact national parks, forest lands, monuments, or tribal lands. The effect on Oregon is very uncertain that it would actually have much of a benefit, but it's a start because, as we know, the feds took over a lot of this land and were given management of it in exchange for it being harvestable in the case of forest land and usable for other purposes in the case of other land for grazing and for mining and oil and gas. And as we know, the Democrats have gotten policies put into place that made that almost impossible to do any of that. In fact, they've reduced the access to this. So let's watch this. It's a big deal. Um, so here's some news that you'll want to put on your radar. There might be Oregon's kicker tax rebates might be coming to an end. If there is a supermajority, then they might be able to influence this by messing with the kicker law and how it's implemented, um, and how they do their forecasts. So stay tuned for that. The supermajority that the Democrats will have will matter. Meanwhile, in other news, Ron Wyden has demanded answers from Portland General Electric because electricity bills have surged 40% since 2021. Now, this is laughable because Ron Wyden should know that the reason why this has been happening is because they've been implementing clean energy requirements that have taken offline all the cheap, reliable energy sources that they could get rid of, and then flooded in with a bunch of subsidized clean energy that they're required to do, and all those costs have been passed on to the customers. So, um, so Ron Wyden is actually investigating why this is happening, and he should already know the answer. But he's making demands of PGE, who used to be like best pals with the Democrats. And now, of course, the thanks they're going to get is that they're going to be hit with, they're going to be attacked and scapegoated by the Democrats as the reason why the cost of electricity in Oregon is going up. Amazon is not waiting to see what happens with this. They want to pursue having nuclear reactors power its Eastern Oregon data centers. Now, right now, they can't actually do any of these reactors in Oregon. They'll all have to be up in Washington State and adjoining states. But they want to get small modular reactors in place so that they can reliably power with what they describe as clean energy. And it is very low risk. It can't melt down. The type of small reactors, they don't get hot enough. They have a lot of advanced safety features in place. But they said that while a wind turbine produces less than 3 megawatts of power, and you need 10 acres worth of solar panels to produce 1 megawatt, smaller modular reactors produce somewhere between 50 and 300 megawatts. The traditional nuclear reactors produce 1,000, but they're big and they have these safety issues. But so the small modular ones could actually produce massive amounts of electricity that wouldn't involve carbon emissions, so all these companies can reach their goals. It's worth watching this because one of the big producers and the only nuclear regulatory agency certified a small modular reactor is produced by NuScale in Corvallis, which I've had the opportunity to tour and view. So hopefully this actually works eventually to the benefit of a growing new industry sector. There's the ADVANCE Act, by the way, at the federal level that's supposed to help make this even easier to do going forward. And then this company in Corvallis. California, Newsom, the governor, wants to replace the $7,500 federal EV credit with a state-funded one if it goes away, if the Trump administration eliminates that EV tax credit, which is very unpopular, by the way, in Michigan. Because it has led to all this push for that has led to a drop in jobs and a whole bunch of other issues. But they say that this EV credit will do one thing: it will exclude Tesla. That's what Newsom, because he hates Tesla, even though it's the only EV company that's based in California. So go figure. And of course, Musk has pointed this out, and I think that's going to draw more attention going forward. But watch out, because they'll try to implement something like this in Oregon. So watch out for that. The last two stories I wanted to mention to you relates to something that's happened in Lake Oswego. There's a track coach who objected to transgender athletes competing in girls' meets um, here in Oregon. He was terminated by the Lake Oswego School District. His name's John Parks. However, he has filed a free speech lawsuit in federal court. And apparently, two things have happened with this case. One is that it appears that he is likely to succeed in showing that the district violated his free speech. That's the determination by U.S. District Judge Michael Simon. However, even though he's likely to prevail, this judge, U.S. District Judge Michael Simon, has refused to compel the Lake Oswego School District to hire him back. And here's the interesting thing: U.S. District Judge Michael Simon is the husband of Democrat Congresswoman from Oregon's First District, Suzanne Bonamici. So remember that. That's what's happening right now in the context of Lake Oswego. So even though it looks like he's going to prevail, he's not going to get his job back. He'll probably win a big settlement, but that's just another way of preventing or allowing school districts to do what they want to do to people and then pass the bill to taxpayers later as they pursue their DEI stuff. But here's some good news. And this is the last story here. Walmart has announced the departure from DEI initiatives. Walmart says that it will identify and remove inappropriate sexual and transgender products marketed to children in their stores. This is what they said in their press release. We've been on a journey, and we know we aren't perfect, but every decision comes from a place of wanting to foster a sense of belonging, to open doors to opportunities for all our associates, customers, and suppliers, and to be a Walmart for everyone. But it said it's going to stop. It's going to refrain from financing events aimed at sexually influencing children, stop participating in Human Rights Coalition Corporate Equality Index, remove the gender-neutral term Latinx from its documents. And according to a conservative filmmaker who's actually producing a documentary about Walmart and its DEI initiatives, he's the one who's revealed this information, apparently. And the company's supplier inclusion program will be changed. It was criticized due to its tendency to give preferential treatment on the basis of race to suppliers, as well as to women and LGBTQ individuals, where they said that they were going to have 51% of those individuals, of those suppliers, be from those categories of people. And so they kind of left out whether or not they would continue to send $100 million to the Center for Racial Equality over the next 5 years, but that's what they plan to do. And this is a great step forward because the dam is going to start cracking. Other companies have started dropping their DEI practices. Lowe's, Home Improvement, Ford, Jack Daniels, John Deere, Tractor Supply, and Harley Davidson are among the companies that have started dumping these policies. And we're going to expect to see this rooted out as well within the federal government and the U.S. military. So the trend is moving in the direction of the ex-track coach in Lake Oswego. And I think maybe eventually Democrats are going to pick up on this. Anyway, so that's the news for today. I hope you enjoy the show and look forward to bringing you more shows here in the future. But Don and Sunny should be back tomorrow night with the next episode of The Captive Audience. Again, thanks everyone for watching. For me, a happy